I just want to take a moment and thank all the volunteers this morning. The band is so dedicated and is here every single week, and there's usually more of us. But Katie was sick this morning at the last. She called me at the last minute and said she couldn't make it, and we hope she feels better soon. Ella woke up sick this morning and can't sing very well either. So I usually don't sing all the songs. I'm not that full of myself to do that. And I know we're having shortage in the tech booth as well. So thank you to those volunteers who are here helping make sure the service runs smoothly and we can stream it out to the world. So just thanks all around. So 6 or 7 years ago, my wife Becca and I were at a wedding for a couple of our friends. And it feels like to me weddings fall into three categories. You either know just the bride and the groom, or you know maybe one half of the wedding, or you kind of know everyone at the wedding, right? And for me, the amount of fun that I have at one of those events is directly proportional to the number of people I know. And so this was one of the fun weddings that we were at. We knew the bride and groom well, and a lot of it was people from around here that we knew, and we had a really good time. And so when we were at the reception, we were sitting at a table with some of our friends and then just some mutual acquaintances, people we knew but weren't all that close to. And as the evening is winding down, we were saying our goodbyes to everyone. And one of the couples at our table says, this was a really fun evening. You should come to our wedding next weekend. And I didn't know how to respond. I knew they were engaged, but I didn't realize that their wedding was a week away because I didn't get to save the date or an invitation. So I clearly was not an A-lister for this event. What am I to do? What is the culturally, socially acceptable response in that situation when you get an invitation that you're not entirely certain is sincere? Is it more polite to decline or to accept? And if you do decide to accept, are you going to have fun? Are you going to feel comfortable knowing that you maybe are not the most welcome guest? Are you going to willfully step into a space where you might not feel like you belong? These are the questions we ask ourselves when we are skeptical of hospitality. And our early church ancestors were asking themselves these same questions. The epistle letters do well to remind us that the early Christians were not monocultural, right? Romans, the book of Romans in the Bible, was written only 20 or so years after Jesus died. So every Christian had to be either a first or second generation convert. No one was born and raised in the church at that time. Or if they were still children. And these converts were largely Jewish. They were God's people who believed that Jesus fulfilled their prophecies. But probably around 49 AD, the year 49, Emperor Claudius kicks all the Jews out of Rome, mostly because of issues between the Jewish people and the Christian Jews who were living there. They were, all sorts of squabbles, things like that. So the Roman churches that these Christian Jews had founded were then made up of only the Gentile converts that were left. And that faith community grew, and it changed in the absence of the people who had founded the church. It was 5 or so years that the Jews were expelled. And then when the communities reintegrated, there were lots of questions about who was in charge. Which customs should we continue to practice? And more importantly, what does it mean to identify not as a Gentile Christian or a Jewish Christian, but a Christian? And they would, as history tells us, they would find that identity, and then they would be severely persecuted for a while after that. So they may have regretted that decision. But they did. They solidified their identity as just Christians. But there was lots of squabbling between these communities. They weren't sure how to treat each other, and they weren't sure how to treat others. And so Paul hears about the struggles of this community in Rome, and he writes this letter. And he spends the entire early part of Romans. I love the book of Romans. He spends the whole early chapters addressing topics of grace and salvation, the ways that we are saved, and arguing that it doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter if you were Jewish or Gentile, because now you are Christian. And then when we pick up here in chapter 12, He is done trying to convince them of that oneness, and he has made all of his arguments about salvation and grace, and he wants to outline the virtues of being a true Christian. What does it mean to live like Christ? I love this first line of verse 9, and especially in the NRSV. The NRSV says, "Let love be genuine." Let love be genuine and hate what is evil. A literal translation of the Greek text might say that love is without hypocrisy, which is an interesting translation, but it's even more interesting in the original Greek context. Anyone know what a hypocrite was in ancient times? It was an actor. A hypocrite was someone on a stage who wore a mask. So Paul is telling us that our love cannot be superficial. It cannot be a mask that we put on for others. It has to be something that we actually feel and live. And we see this in verse 15 where he says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep." That is not empathy that we are being called to. It is sympathy. We need to actually feel the joys and the pains of those around us. Now, coincidentally, Becca and I had this passage read at our wedding. This was one of the two scriptures we had because we loved all the things that it had to say. All these wonderful things about love. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. And while this is certainly applicable to a marriage, right? Paul is not writing about romantic love, which is the case of most Bible verses that get read at weddings, by the way. Paul's using the words like Philadelphia, brotherly love, sibling love, and agape, godlike love. In this passage, he is literally telling them, love your friends like you would love your family, and let that love be the kind of love that God gives. He goes on in the passage to write, help needy Christians, be inventive in hospitality. That's what it says in the Message translation we read earlier. The NRSV translates it as, contribute to the needs of the saints, extend hospitality to strangers. To strangers. You know, it's fun to set up a meal, host an event, have a party with your friends and family. But how often do you post flyers for your events and just let anyone come into your house? How often is it to have genuine hospitality to strangers? It's hard. It's much trickier. It's scary. It's hard because we are biologically predisposed and then socially conditioned on top of that to be wary of strangers. Back when we were just surviving in caves, a stranger was a threat to our survival, right? And our ancestors that survived were the ones who learned to be afraid. They were the ones who learned that anything different was a threat. So we have evolution working against us to this day. That fear of the other is ingrained in our DNA, literally. And it's influenced social norms throughout history. It's been used to justify racism and sexism. It probably led to the two words that we teach our children to keep them safe. What do we tell them? Stranger danger. Stranger danger. It's two words, it rhymes. Things that rhyme have to be true. Now, by all means, let's keep teaching our children that. There's a good reason we say stranger danger, right? There are scary things out there. But someday we have to grow up. We have to grow up as communities who move beyond stranger danger. We have to grow up as a species that can overcome the subconscious fear of things that are different. There are ways that we can work together, ways that we can create safe spaces to carry out God's will together. We don't have to put ourselves in danger to accept the stranger. We were not designed to be an insular population of individuals. Humans are social creatures. And even if we wanted to be individualistic, the earth could not sustain that kind of lifestyle for all of us. Last year, the global population crossed 8 billion people. 8 billion humans on the earth now that need to eat, they need a place to live, and and they need a community. And every one of those things is getting harder and harder to come by. Food prices continue to rise because of, take your pick, corporate greed, war, climate change. Doesn't matter. It's causing people to suffer regardless of whatever the root of the problem is. Food insecurity, especially among children, is on the rise in America. There's a desperate demand for affordable housing across the country, but you don't need to look any further than 40,000 people down the street who need somewhere to live every year. And even before COVID, there was another silent epidemic sweeping our nation. And it is loneliness. I don't know if you heard, in May this year, the U.S. Surgeon General released a public health advisory on the epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And in that report, they found that almost 50% of adults in the U.S. were experiencing loneliness. And that was before COVID locked us down. Those problems have only been exacerbated since then. And to show how much of a problem it was, the report found that this lack of connection has the same effect on your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Over a pack a day if you are experiencing loneliness. The Surgeon General, his name is Dr. Vivek Murthy, said this in an NPR interview. It's hard to put a price tag, if you will, on the amount of human suffering that people are experiencing right now. And you can feel lonely even if you have lots of people around you, because loneliness is about the quality of your connections. Do you hear Paul's words echoing in that? Let love be genuine, authentic. We need authentic connections with each other to remain not only happy, but healthy. Our problem with connectedness is multifaceted. The rise of social media has led to us having more relationships, but the quality of those relationships has significantly decreased. The ease of access to celebrities on social media, through interviews, things like that, has given rise to parasocial relationships. Another problem is the decline of faith-based communities. And beyond faith, other socially centered organizations. That means there are fewer opportunities for us to gather, fewer opportunities for us to form bonds. And then the media and social media, they constantly feed us fear and outrage because it is the only thing that gets us engaged anymore. It is the only way to keep ratings up, is to keep us scared and upset. The Surgeon General's advisory outlines a strategy to advance social connection. And there's a part at the end for churches. Churches have a role to play in the solution to this, obviously. There are several calls to action. Create opportunities and spaces for inclusive social connection. Actively seek and build partnerships with other community institutions. Foster a culture of connection in the broader community. We're doing some of these things. We are already doing these things. We have the Queer Christian Fellowship that meets on Wednesdays. Anyone participating in the Growing Young book club that we're looking at. We were just at the Hunger Hike last week, where the community was coming together to solve some of these problems. We're doing these things, yet we need help to continue doing them. We cannot do them alone. It cannot be the staff of this church doing it. It cannot be just a handful of volunteers. We all need to participate. This is the first Sunday of our stewardship season. We're doing this series around stewardship. The series is called The Table. Communion is central to our identity as Christians and as United Methodists. And one of the things I love about the United Methodist traditions is that the table is open to everyone. There is no secret handshake or password. There's no dress code. There's no prerequisites, except that you seek repentance and strive for peace with one another. As we sang this morning, you are simply invited to come as you are. So we didn't end up going to that wedding. I think I wasn't sure if the invitation was real or not, right? We were invited, but would we have been welcome? I don't know, but hospitality is a two-way street. We have to not only be gracious in the ways that we extend hospitality to strangers, you have to be willing to accept hospitality from a stranger. You have to play both roles in the interaction. The location of the Last Supper, the first communion, was in the home of a stranger, someone Jesus saw walking into his house on the street. At one time or another, we have all come to Jesus as strangers, looking for something that we could not find in ourselves. So to help remind us of God's grace and the radical hospitality that we experience, we're going to be celebrating communion every Sunday during stewardship. As we celebrate at the table, we consider what we're going to bring to the table in the coming year. I want you to walk away from this series, from this week, from every Sunday you come to this church, knowing that you are never an afterthought at God's table. You are always invited, and more than that, you are always welcome. That is the radical hospitality of God's kingdom. We invite others to join us out of love that is genuine, love that is sincere. And this hospitality goes beyond extending invitations, because that's the bare minimum that we can do. We have to pay attention to who actually shows up. And more importantly, we have to pay attention to who does not show up. Who is missing from the table? And how do we work together to reconcile them and bring them into the fold? We have to work together until every seat at God's expansive table is full. It's not easy work. It's hard work. But the importance of that connection is vital to our faith and to our health and to us living in community together. Thanks be to God. Amen.